different styles, and it kind of creates a very messy, we call it spaghetti type situation when you have all these different managers training their folks, however they feel fit or however they want to do it. In the past couple of years, we've actually we brought on an actual director of our Memory Blue Academy, which is our onboarding program, and she's solely responsible for getting all of our SDRs company-wide up to speed as quickly as possible and taking them through our 6-week onboarding program. And since we did that, it just makes it more systematic. It makes things more consistent, and it makes sure that everyone is learning things the same way, and at least they're going about the way that we want them to go about all of it.
Love it. Love it. David, I'm super curious what you think about, just given what Caroline has said and what Nimit has said about the hiring manager owning this onboarding piece, right? Owning the coaching part of it. Where do you begin when you're doing this for a team, David? Where do you begin as far as, assembling those key components as a system to set folks up for success?
Yeah, actually, just as how Nimit described how things used to be at Memory Blue is kind of how things are at Network for Good right now. So in terms of who owns training, I guess technically it's me, but it really is the whole management team that has a lot of input into what goes on with training. And we have 2 BDR managers at Network for Good, and we have one that's in charge of the onboarding training as their second job. And one is in charge of the transition training to that FSC level. But all the managers are participating in onboarding and running those different training sessions, which, like Nimit mentioned, can definitely be difficult because a lot of times they have their own ideas on what training should be and what onboarding should be. So what we try and do is make sure, hey, this is the structure, this is the framework, but I do think it is important to have them exposed to different people within the organization, the whole sales management team, the product team, the marketing team, the success team, so that they can build more relationships with other people in the company as well.
For sure. And there's go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just one thing to add. I love the idea of if you have an enablement person, whether it's somebody who has that as their job or a portion of their job, that person is a force multiplier, right? So the manager, I would say, really owns onboarding. Their job is to find the right person for that role and make sure that person is successful in getting up to speed in the ramp. Where I've seen onboarding not work so well is when you ship them off to training someplace and then you expect as a manager that you're getting somebody who is super productive and ready to go. And then it's the enablement person's problem if they're not in that place. I think it has to be a really tight partnership between that, whether it's a director of L&D or a training and development person or an enablement person, whoever that person is, that they're working closely with the manager to make sure that there is consistency in what that onboarding experience looks and feels like. There's great cross calibration, there's great communication, but that the manager ultimately feels like they are the one responsible for that person's success, that it's not somebody else's job to make sure that person is successful.
So you're not a fan of the SDR easy bake oven where you just put them in there
No.
and then they come out fully formed? And it's time, and they're going to make all the calls and set all the meetings.
Right.
No, I think this is really important. It sort of leads us into this next question of why does onboarding need an overhaul? I'm going to start with some numbers for you guys, just to sort of frame up what we're really talking about here. These are from Bamboo HR, right? Only 12% of employees think their company did a good job with onboarding. And when you look at that alongside what it costs to replace an employee, right, this being anywhere between 90 to 200% of that employee's annual salary, I think that that makes the case, right? That tells us all why we're here. But I'd like to hear from each of you, and we'll start with you, Nimit, why you believe onboarding needs an overhaul.
Yeah, because I think sales is always changing, and sales methodologies are always changing, and the way that you approach a prospect is always changing. So you have to then change the way that you are onboarding your sales reps. The way that you teach how to pick up the phone and make a cold call 5 years ago is completely different than how you would do that now. So I think there has to be changes there, but at the same time, there has to be more flexibility, I think, with onboarding, especially as people are moving to remote and are going to be remote for the foreseeable future. That we have to change the way that we actually, teach them the processes, the way that we actually teach them how to sell, and then making sure that they're applying that and actually using that information and getting proof of them actually, using that onboarding.
I like that. I like that. It reminds me of something that David said as we were preparing for this conversation, because you, Nimit, there were kind of putting a little bit of the onus on the employee, right? In getting to be successfully onboarded. And David was talking about hiring for emotional intelligence and how that plays a role in the cultural aspects of onboarding and in how you design your onboarding program. David, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that emotional intelligence, the assessments that you had mentioned, as far as how that can help set folks up for success as well in onboarding.
Yeah. So I would say this was not, well, it still is not my expertise, but one of our BDR managers, Orrin Webb, I would say he's our emotional intelligence expert. And he, when he was interviewing for the role, that's what he pitched, is this is what we need to do. And now when we're interviewing people, Orrin's quizzing me, okay, what is this guy a giver? Is he a guider? What kind of personality does he have? And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're only hiring certain personality types, but it's something that's really important to keep in mind in terms of how somebody's going to want to be coached, what their strengths are going to be, and maybe some of what their challenges are going to be. So we do Strengths Finder with all of our new hires, and we do MBTI with all of our managers. And Orrin will typically do a review with the rep, and then the managers, typically we do a regroup and pretty much every quarter to go over the differences between our personalities, what some of our triggers are, how we can help one another get out of the shadow, as Orrin says. So those are kind of some key things that we focus on with emotional intelligence. Yeah. But another thing too, talking about onboarding that I think is really important to keep in mind is when you have somebody on onboarding, that's typically their first impression of your company. And that's also when maybe they start possibly second guessing their decision that they might have made. I've definitely gone to companies and started my first day, and I've definitely said, what did I just do? And it typically is something that lasts. So I think it's really important as a part of onboarding to make sure that they're pumped up about your company, wanting to work there, and they have a great impression through that onboarding process. Obviously, goal is to learn a bunch of information, but we want them to be excited about being there too.
I love that. And Caroline, you had mentioned something along these lines in talking about, taking a few steps back in this onboarding conversation and really being intentional about hiring for the right profile. I'm super curious to hear you dig into that for us a little bit.
Sure. I was going to say, so for some organizations, they may not need to overhaul their onboarding, right? They might be doing it well. And if they feel like they've got, if they're new hires based on the ramps that they're expecting are meeting or exceeding those numbers, then they probably do have a great onboarding program in place. But if they don't, it's probably a step back. First, looking at job profile, are we seeking the right skills from the right sort of people? So I see this happen probably more in the AE role or AM role than SDR, for example. But I think we tend to be a little bit more clear on what we're looking for from an SDR. But for an AE, there's a big difference between somebody who's been really successful at another organization where they've got a lot of resources and hiring for an AE job at a startup where they need to be super transactional and they need to own the entire sales process from breaking in and getting somebody to pay attention to them all the way through the full cycle sale. So making sure that you get the right profile is really critical. And one of the things that I'm super passionate about, particularly right now in this context of what's going on very tragically in the nation and in the world, is how I think a lot of the competencies and job profiles often have not caught up with the 21st century, more diverse workforce, more inclusive environment. You look at a lot of job descriptions and a lot of language, which is still very gendered, often exclusive in some of the requirements or responsibilities that it has, and hopefully unintentionally is excluding people who may be amazing for that organization. So I think getting the profile right and making sure that it actually reflects what you want your sales force to look like is the first critical step of that. And then looking at some of the other pieces around adult learning, right? Like a lot of classroom-based training, you have an instructor-led environment where somebody is talking at you or talking to you for a while, but very few people actually retain information that way. They need to be able to apply it really immediately, and in order to be able to retain it. So to be able to make sure that your onboarding program has lots of opportunities in the classroom and outside the classroom, particularly in a virtual classroom, to be able to learn something, practice it more, certify on it, I think is a big part of where we see not only a lot of the technology that supports sales enablement functions today going with a lot of recording technology and certification opportunities, but also even if you're doing that on a manual level, that's really where you get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of investment from an onboarding perspective.
I love that you mentioned, particularly in a virtual environment, because I have got a question about how all of this changes with the curveball that has been the year 2020 and everyone working remote. We'll get to that here in a second. I just right now want to speak directly to the attendees and invite you to participate in the conversation over in the chat. You can drop questions. I'm planning to leave the last 10 minutes or so of this session for us to have a Q&A, and I'm super interested in what you guys came here to learn about overhauling onboarding. But first, I do want to pose this question to the entire panel, specifically for you. What did that pivot look like when we went from, onboarding in offices, which I personally experienced much differently from in a remote environment? I gotta believe it's pretty tough, but you guys are here because you're doing it right. So we'll start with you, Nimit. What did that pivot to remote onboarding look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, of course, at first there was a lot of just confusion. I think there was a lot of the outside world kind of bleeding into that, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how what was really going to be happening. But I think once that settled down a little bit, it went fairly smoothly because with our onboarding, we put a big focus on the application of it, right? We do a 2-day boot camp, but then that's followed by, only because we know that they're not going to be able to retain all that information, that we really focus those next 6 weeks on actually applying the techniques that were learned during that boot camp. So for example, introduction and opening statement, that cohort has to go bring a call recording. We use Exec Vision. They bring a call recording of them actually delivering their introduction and their opening statement. So that part of it already be kind of virtual kind of makes it, that made the transition kind of easy. But I think what made it more difficult was the fact that, having it all virtual is just, you have to deal, you have to kind of look at people's body language a little bit more, making sure they're actually engaged. That part of it, I think made it the most difficult and the most challenging. And to keep everybody engaged is very difficult to do when you're not in a room where everyone's looking at you.
Right. What was it like for you, David?
It was pretty difficult. I think that myself and the management team told our executive team for our April class, hey, let's not hire them. Let's push this back a little bit so we can prep and make some changes, because we don't think it's going to go well. And we went ahead and did the class anyway, and it was pretty challenging. I think Nimit hit on a couple points. We were used to the in-office environment of onboarding, but the biggest thing that we didn't adjust for is all the social interaction that we had built into the onboarding in the first couple of weeks. Like, hey, it's really important. We feel that you talk to everyone in the office. You grab lunch with pretty much all the other departments. And although you're not learning during that time, the social interaction is really important, especially when you have salespeople.
Right.
And we did not put that in to a virtual onboarding program, and it was a big miss. So in terms of our April class, the numbers have not been as successful. So I think what we did is, hey, we need to build time in to this virtual onboarding class for them to get to know other departments, just like we used to before. So what I would say is we didn't do a great job adjusting to it, and we're still working on adjusting to it now. And we're getting a little bit better each class that we've had.
We're all doing it alongside you, man. I asked the question in past tense, right? But to your point, this is something that I think we'll all be navigating for the foreseeable future, right? Caroline.
So I can mostly, probably 99.9% credit Heather Donahoe Hicks, who's my senior manager responsible for onboarding and development at EverFi. She, knowing that it was under executive scrutiny and knowing how important it was that we had a class starting on March 23rd and we had our last day in the office March 13th, she really leveraged BrainShark, which is the technology that we use for sales readiness, in conjunction with a lot more live, but facilitated over Google Meet or Ring Central, which are the two platforms that we use for virtual technology. I think she wound up meeting with that crew almost every day, if not every day, once or twice a day. So to David's point, I think we were somewhat benefited at EverFi by not having a lot of online learning yet. We were using technology for mostly practice and certification, and then having some of the training, recorded for folks to go back and refer to. And we built out a whole knowledge center where you can go and find information and tools and assets. So because we hadn't done a lot in terms of e-learning, it actually enabled us to have a lot more in-person interactions, even though they were over the web. She did require that everybody was on camera, which for us was already something that we had been doing. I had seen Gong talk about 7 times more, your close rates are 7 times higher when you're meeting by phone, or by with your camera on. And so I had our reps using their camera much more aggressively internally already. So when we moved to a virtual environment, it was a kind of a natural extension. Whereas my husband is an attorney, we're however many months into COVID, 7 months or whatever, he still does 90% of his calls over the phone. It doesn't see anyone that he's interacting with. So I think that was for us, she was able to bring together a lot more cohesion and make them feel like they were getting that live experience, even though it wasn't in an office space. It was not perfect, of course, but I think she just deserves a ton of credit for how she was able to rethink what it feels like to be a new person and get some of that social connection through Zoom. The other thing that we've gotten really good at, so a lot of those virtual coffees and other things, I remember when I started at a job, I had 20 of those virtual coffees over 2 weeks. I had no idea what to talk to anybody about. Like, I don't even know who you are. What am I supposed to talk to you about? And then later I realized, oh, wow, that was somebody really impressive. I should have asked them some really specific things. Right. So one of the things that we've been engineering is when we do those virtual coffees or meetings, here are the 3 questions to tee up that conversation, or here are the 3 or 4 things to learn from them so that you know what to do, and that they don't all go in the first 2 weeks. They go across, a couple of months or a month and a half once you're in a position to actually absorb more from that time.
I absolutely love that idea. I was in a situation in the not so distant past where I'm, on my calendar was placed a meeting with the gentleman on the team. As far as I knew, turns out he's chief product officer. And I had a lot of questions about the product, only I didn't know he was the guy to ask. It was fine. We talked about like our kids and stuff. It was cool, a cool meet and greet. But to your point, right? If onboarding is supposed to be this path to productivity, then certainly folks would do well to do what you just mentioned, right? Which is tee up those conversations with that productivity in mind. And a lot of what the 3 of you have said, right? When we're talking about, how to get folks up and running in a remote environment, a lot of these are culture answers that you're giving. And it sort of leads me into this next idea that I'm really curious about with you guys, which is how do we infuse the onboarding process with these, culture initiatives? How do we set the tone for inclusion and belonging through an onboarding process. I think most folks, they understand what the productivity metrics are or goals are when it comes to, ramping someone in an SDR role, right? I'm trying to get them up to be able to produce, right? Meetings, revenue, pipeline, and all of that. But it gets a little bit trickier when we're talking about what we're getting them up to speed to with respect to our culture at a company and how we infuse, again, inclusion and belonging into that process. So I see you nodding, Caroline. So I'm going to go ahead and let you start this one off and tell us what that looks like for you.
I was nodding. I'm not sure that it's because I have the answer. I think so two things. One is kind of picking up where I was just talking about with those informal coffees and things. If you think about it from that new hires experience too, it feels really awkward to go out to coffee with somebody, whether that's live or virtual, if you have no idea how to talk to them, or if you're meeting this chief product officer in day 3 and you don't even know what the product is, you're missing an opportunity. So I think that the cultural ways that I think we can help people come up to speed on the organization is we can use some of those virtual moments, but tee up some of those questions around, okay, so if you've been here for 3 or 4 years and I'm suggesting that you're going off to coffee or virtual coffee with somebody who's brand new, make sure that you're including what's an example of what culture looks like here for you? Or what's an example, take the, what are the observable behaviors that align with our value system here? So let's pick a value. What's something that we care about? What's something that is part of our mission? What is some demonstrable example of you in that role? What have you done? Why has that been so successful? Something that informs that new hire on what it means to be successful culturally in that organization, but using observable behaviors, because I think that is that's really challenging. There's a lot of kind of it's the it factor that they have in sales, which often is coded language for what we're trying to get away from, honestly, and in creating a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So I think I think that's where we can be much more prescriptive to say, so if you're a brand new SDR and you're going to have coffee with the person who's responsible for revenue and this team, this is a little bit about their background. Here are 3 things to ask them, and then find out one thing about, from a cultural perspective, one of the values that we have, what's an example of how they exemplify that every week with their team, right? Something that helps them to understand, that new person to understand what it means to be culturally belonging within that organization.
Right. So laying out what it is that the organization or the individual or both are doing to help new folks feel included, to foster a sense of belonging. I can tell you, when we talked a little bit ahead of time, and we'll get to this question here in a moment, but we talked about, you start a new job and they've got, trainings on your calendar, right? You've got your how to use Salesforce training or how to use this tool or that. Very seldom, as part of onboarding anyway, is there this training on how do we treat people here? How do we help other folks feel a sense of inclusion and belonging here in this place? And I know that when we discussed it offline, David and Nimit, we basically came up with the fact that it's a blind spot for a lot of folks. It's a spot where a lot of folks need guidance. But not everybody's getting it completely wrong. So to an extent, you just got to forgive yourself. If we're saying things right now and you're thinking, oh, I haven't done that in my onboarding, it's okay. That's why we're here. Anything to add on the infusing or setting the tone for culture and inclusion in the onboarding process from you, Nimit?
Yeah, I think, making it clear, and we were just talking about this before, of, inclusion kind of also meaning that it's okay to ask questions. Like, you don't feel like you're the odd person out if you're not asking, if it made you feel like the odd person out if you're asking too many questions, right? Because that can kind of give the impression that you're not understanding as quickly, but everybody learns differently. We know that for sure, because we hire a lot, we have tons of SDRs coming through. Not everyone's going to learn the same way. So setting that tone very clearly from the manager, from the training facilitator, everybody from upper management, of that you're here obviously because you're in a sales position, and as part of a sales position you have to perform, and it's a results oriented business, but you're going to learn how to be a professional as well. And that doesn't just mean how to sell, but also how to be a professional in the workplace, especially if your SDRs that you're bringing on are going to be early on in their careers, right? we typically hire, fresh college grads as kind of a majority. So for them, we have to teach them how to be a professional. Like, how do you work in a workplace, right? It's not college anymore, right? And that comes with its own sets of challenges. So I think you're setting the tone of, hey, we want you to ask questions, and encouraging it, because I remember back when I was an SDR, and I was terrified to ask questions sometimes, just because you don't want to feel like you're the one person not getting it. So I mean, it's very difficult to do, as you were talking about, Nikki, to make that happen. We're all learning together how to make it more inclusive.
We are, but I like what you said though, because I don't typically think of it in those terms, right? But I think that putting it that way, right, saying we're teaching you how to be a professional, is an effective way to reach people who don't get right away, or who may not get right away, why a lot of these culture or inclusion conversations are even necessary, right? So framing it up to those folks in particular, like, hey, this is how you be a professional, this is how you be successful, I think has the potential to be really, really effective. Thanks for that, Nimit. David, any thoughts on this?
I was just gonna, what Nimit said when he was an SDR and he was terrified, is something that stands out to me, because, at one point, I think we had an issue where SDRs were terrified of not booking a slam dunk demo for the reps or particular reps, and based on the feedback that they were going to get. And we just had to have a conversation and say, hey, this is not appropriate feedback. This is not an appropriate relationship between an SDR and an AE. You are there as an account executive to provide constructive feedback, and the better feedback and more constructive feedback that you provide, the better demonstrations that you're going to get. Right. The more money you're going to make, the more money the SDR is going to make. So I think we try and say through the hiring process, when people ask, what's your culture like? When people start, what's your culture like? We want a competitive environment, but it has to be collaborative. And if you go ask anybody a question, they better be willing to answer that question, because there's no secret sauce. We want to be sharing what might be that secret sauce between everybody here. And we don't want people that aren't going to have that collaborative environment or collaborative approach on our sales team.
I like it. So Eric Ham here, one of the attendees, has said, remotely, our team found that there was a bit of a lift required of our senior reps to pitch in and help BDRs feel welcome and less intimidated about booking meetings for them. And it's exactly what you're talking about, David. And it actually relates to this next idea that I want to discuss. So we talked about how, sometimes there are these two camps, right? There are those folks that are like, it's got to be formal training. And there are these folks that are like, nah, it's got to be informal training. It sounds like what we've been discussing here is some happy medium between them. What I'm really interested in is what each of you might find are the must-haves on the formal training piece, and some of the less thought about, but things that you might have seen success with in terms of the informal piece. And I'll just throw this one out there, jump in, whoever would like to answer first.
I think on the formal, go ahead. Oh. You go first, Caroline.
Sorry, I think I have some unstable internet connection issues, so sorry if it's going in and out. I think that I learned this. There's a woman named Nancy Narden, and she actually used the Maslow's hierarchy of need to talk about the tech stack. And the fundamental need I see, whether it's for an AE or an SDR, is understanding who the ideal customer profile is and the persona to go after. And then from there, you can start to build your language, your messaging, what your outreach sounds like. If you start with, here's your Salesforce login, and here's what you need to do, and here's how you log an opportunity, and here's how you create an event, and then here's some sample scripting, it's really out of context and sequence. So I think understanding the most critical thing that I think we can give to an SDR or any sales role in their first couple of weeks is, who are we going after? Why these people? What do they care about? What's hard for them? And then everything else should follow, right? This is then the type of messaging that we use, and here's why. If you're talking to this person, this is what's going to resonate for them. Now let's practice that. The other thing that I think is really critical, particularly in a remote environment, I think it's been increasingly critical over the last 5 years, though, is writing. So how you approach somebody on LinkedIn, how you approach somebody on voicemail, how you approach somebody on a quick email, how you actually get out of just having every sales loft cadence look like it's coming across. I know when I can tell you the 10 people right now who are SDRs who right now have me in a cadence because I've seen the same email from 5 other companies. So I think, making sure that we teach people how to personalize for relevance. There's a big difference between personalization, which is saying, hey, Caroline, I checked out your LinkedIn profile and it seems like we have a lot in common. Not usually accurate. And hey, Caroline, I see that EverFi is doing this really important thing. And because of that, your CEO just mentioned this, and we do work around this, and I'm wondering if there might be a connection there. I'd love to talk with you a little bit more. That's relevance, which is different from personalization. The fact that I went to Smith College and you went there too only tells me that we have some common background, does not tell me that why I should make 30 minutes of my time to speak with you. So I think the writing and the really understanding the persona and the ideal customer profile so that you can set up really great meetings and have a really great sales experience is super critical.
Caroline, that's a pretty big shift from most of what I experienced in my career in onboarding, meaning these context pieces, these, basically these things that go into helping folks feel more confident going into executing the work that they must do are the things that had been treated like, you'll learn that as you go. You'll feel better as you go. A few months down the line, you'll learn that. Right now, I just need you to know how to create an opportunity in Salesforce. Right now, I just need you to know how to build these lists. And all of that is important. But like we talked about, that's why we have to be intentional about this intersection of the informal and the formal training. And as you mentioned, it needs to, the timing of those things needs to be aligned, right? So both of you, David and Nimit, are nodding your heads. David, we'll go to you first and tell us about your thoughts on this piece of it.
I guess I would say what's important is to formalize all the informal pieces that you need to do. So all that unstructured time should be structured, as in, hey, we want you to listen to calls in Exec Vision. And you're going to listen to calls from Mary, who's one of her top reps. And we're going to go through kind of grading that call. And there's going to be a process of, hey, we're not going to give you any information on what grading is at first. And then you're going to learn a little bit more about what that is a couple of days in. And then a few further days in, things might change there a little bit. What is expected of role plays? How should that be structured in working with other members of the team? So scheduling and formalizing all those informal processes so everyone knows what's expected during those times.
Absolutely. Nimit, you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm glad I had Caroline go first because her answer was way better than what I was going to say. But yeah, I think it's you have to think about what parts of the sales conversation aren't scripted. Like what can you not script, right? You can't script rapport building. You can't script empathy. So making sure that as part of your onboarding, you're not forgetting those things. So, talking about what empathy really means, especially right now, how do you be an empathetic seller? What kinds of things should you be saying? What kinds of vocabulary should you be using in your conversations? And David brought up a great point. I mean, leveraging a call coaching solution, right, is like capturing your gold master call. Here's a great call of Nikki using empathy with this prospect. Listen through this call. Let me know your thoughts. Here's a great example of rapport building, and maybe different examples of rapport building. And making sure that part is incorporated into your onboarding.
You got me fired up. I'm sitting here like quoting you in the chat section because
Nice.
You absolutely cannot. You cannot script empathy. You cannot script rapport building, but you can script a lot of, what the messaging is and what the conversation is going to be like, which is why you really don't have to work on that so hard in the very beginning. And it does need to be these other factors. You guys are really giving me the goods. I'm going to ask a bit of a broader question because I think it might be helpful to the attendees here. And those folks who are just listening to us and evaluating their current onboarding process and trying to find some direction. How do you know that your onboarding process is broken? Because there might be folks on this call that thought it was all good. And now they're hearing this stuff and they're like, oh, I might have to change some things. So since we skipped over you like twice, Nimit, I'm gonna let you start off answering this question. How do folks know that their onboarding process is broken?
I think you have to, you have to get feedback from the cohorts, using anonymous surveys throughout the process of trying to gather feedback. Fill out a comment card and actually, follow up on some of that feedback to see if there's anything broken. I think right there, just learning from people going through the program, if you're the person that's putting together the onboarding program, you got to kind of have some thick skin with that, but you have to hear feedback. You have to hear, if you're seeing a trend that a lot of people around a particular subject just don't feel like that was their favorite part or the best part, or they weren't grasping that part of it, then maybe you have to look at, how do you, how can you better structure that? So I'll give you an example. For us, we had a section called picture painting, and that's the part of the sales conversation after you conduct discovery. This is you actually talking about your solution as it pertains to whatever problem or whatever pain you discovered during the discovery. But what we were finding is that we were also calling it differentiation in some of our materials. So our cohorts were getting confused because they saw differentiation, like what's differentiation? Or it's like, well, it's picture painting. And like, what? Wait, what's picture painting? Because it's written as differentiation. And something as minor as that caused a whole bunch of confusion. And that we had to go back and make that change. And we were actually getting feedback from people. So that's how we knew that one part of it was broken, and it was coming through because our SDRs weren't properly conducting that part of the call the way we wanted them to.
Yeah, I think another way might be, just paying attention to, like David was mentioning earlier, right? All of us have probably started at a role and then pretty quickly been like, this was a mistake. So if you're paying attention to the point at which folks tend to leave you, that might be a clue that your onboarding is broken. But David, I'd like you to dig into that idea a little more for us.
Yeah, I think you just said it, when people are leaving. So I'm sure we've all had individuals who started, who have left maybe a month or two in, and it very well can just be, hey, it's not the right fit. We actually had somebody leave last week because he took a job with the Detroit Pistons and working in scouting, prepping for the draft. And I was like, okay, we're good with that one, because I would do that. But we've also had individuals leave 2-3 weeks in because they were so intimidated by getting on the phone and just so nervous that they were going to make a mistake. That's a huge miss. That's hey, we need to overhaul onboarding, overhaul our hiring, look at everything that we did wrong, because it's huge cost to the company, whether you're working with a recruiting firm, and it's huge cost to your team and that individual who it didn't work out for. So just like you said, taking a look at who's leaving, when they're leaving, and why they're leaving is really important. And then maybe the last piece is, Nimit hit on feedback, but I'd say feedback from your customers. So if you're onboarding SDRs, customers are your AEs, and they're definitely going to provide unsolicited feedback and unfiltered feedback in many cases. And that's all great feedback to get, because they really know what's going to put them in the best position to be successful with an opportunity. So those would be kind of the two big things.
Absolutely. So you guys have given some pretty big takeaways, right? There is this understanding how to strike the balance between formal and informal, starting with making sure that before we even get to that part, right? Making sure that we're hiring for the right profile, meaning that we're trying to circumvent bias, right? As Caroline alluded to, and making sure that there is the type of mentorship program that Nimit talked about, where we are encouraging folks to ask questions. And there was some talk before the call offline about specifically including on-demand resources for folks to try and mitigate a lot of that intimidation, right? I've been in a situation, maybe many of you have as well, where, listen, this is my ambassador. I've asked this same question twice already. I still don't get it. I don't want to ask again. So either I don't get that concept or I have an on-demand resource to help me. And so a lot of really cool takeaways that we've got. I want to take this last few minutes that we have to open it up to the attendees. Yes, that's you, the folks there in the chat, to ask any questions that you might have. I'll pause here for just a moment and let you guys put some stuff in there. Beyond that, I'd like to go around as we wait for questions that may or may not come to each of the panelists. And just, I want to hear your best or worst personal experience with onboarding, with yourself as the employee.
I can go first. So, you know, I think it actually, for me, it wasn't when I was an SDR being onboarded. It was when I was promoted to be a manager, to be an SDR manager. I was 9 months into the role. I was 9 months out of college, and all of a sudden I was managing a team of people, that some who were several years older than me. and there really, at that time, there wasn't any type of real onboarding for management. So I think that's something that people should think about it, especially if they're going to be promoting from within their organizations, is making sure you have some type of framework for your managers to follow. So it just caused, I mean, there's a lot of just the typical challenges that you would assume you would come across in that type of situation. It was happening. So that was a terrible experience. I'm like, man, was I the right person for this role? Like, should I have been promoted? Should I have been an SDR longer? All those questions were popping up. So that was a pretty rough experience, at least for me back then.
It's interesting, as you were saying that, Nimit, Sarah Tui, one of the attendees, has asked a question along those lines, right? For a first time AE after being an SDR for many years, what book or training should a person have? And I think what you're saying is there should be an onboarding specific to that situation. And I think a lot of the time we're not seeing that at all. We're seeing, oh, you were the best SDR? Oh, okay, well, come on and be an AE then. Surprise. And then it's like, what even is the training and onboarding for that? I don't think people think that there needs to be one. And I think we've sort of proved out that we've made that case here that there absolutely does. Carolyn, I'll come to you.
For the Sarah question or for the story, or both?
Whichever. It's yours. The floor is yours. Okay.
So, Sarah, I don't know that this is I would say that the Challenger Sale is my favorite sales book, but I would say that what's actually really critical in moving from an SDR to an AE, which isn't a book, but it is the most critical piece of becoming an AE, is really understanding what's going on in the business environment and that business acumen. So I would say that more important than a book is actually reading the Wall Street Journal every day, or reading a couple of really good business publications, and then working with whoever your internal mentor or manager is to say, okay, I just read that so-and-so acquired somebody else. So what are the implications of that for our business? If somebody's going through an acquisition, what does that mean for us? What does that, what sorts of problems are they likely to have? I actually think that that's far more critical. The ability to be empathetic and to be able to talk to somebody about their business challenges is much more important than knowing sales kind of process and fundamentals. Some of that stuff you will actually learn over time with great training. I would say that my onboarding story question I alluded to earlier, having 20 coffees over 2 weeks with a bunch of people where it was just Caroline to meet so-and-so with no context, which forced me to do, look them up on LinkedIn, figure out what they were up to, and then often, realize an hour later that I should have asked them this question. That was kind of a bad onboarding experience. But mostly it was a real bummer because my boss thought he had done this great job of setting me up with all these conversations. And so he thought he was doing an amazing job from an onboarding perspective for the first 2 weeks. And probably that took him 5 to 8 hours to put all those things together and make sure that they were all on my calendar and on that person's calendar. And I think it would have been a great experience had I just had a little bit more direction or had that spaced out a little bit over time.
I think you're right, Caroline. What's been helpful for me as I onboard, I'm recently onboarding here at M-Train, is breaking it up into, people, product, and process. And I think for a lot of folks, when we think about that, the people piece, they're thinking, oh, this new person needs to meet all the people in the company. But the way that you've talked about it and Nimit's talked about it and David's talked about it is that people piece, you do well with the very new person to have that people piece be getting to meet the customers, the prospects, the ICP, right? Because that's going to, than if they were just meeting folks on the team. David, it's your turn. Sorry about that.
No. I'm taking notes here myself. What was my worst onboarding experience? I actually worked at a chemical manufacturer prior to Network for Good for about 4 years. And my grandfather started the company, and I thought I was gonna have this amazing onboarding experience. I had no idea about sales. And I thought sales was, I can definitely do this. I'm putting myself through school, working multiple jobs. I can sell. And started, and there was no onboarding. There's no training program. There's no nothing. It was, hey, this is what we sell. Go figure it out. And that is one way to onboard. And survival of the fittest. Some people will survive, and it was terrifying. And went on my first cold call. Guy said probably no nicely, has a product, and I thought my life was over. And I didn't have anybody to talk to about that. That was my worst onboarding experience.
Aw, well, thank you for sharing that with us. I think all of us can relate in one way or another. Sarah, I see your question in the chat, and I think I can help you. So I will reach out to you offline and figure out what we can get you reading. I've got some folks in my network and likely some folks here on this panel that could probably help you with that question. Otherwise, thank you guys for attending. I hope you got what you needed. If you didn't, then reach out to these panelists and myself individually. We love to help people and coach people and train people and get the more people excited and up to speed and successful and productive in the sales profession. So thank you all for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.